Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne, welcoming back to my channel. Thanks for finding me. Here I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids in Melbourne, Australia, without the help of greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers or any equipment really, and often not much insight, really just me and them struggling along inside, outside, or I can't grow them at all. So if that's your sort of no-nonsense growing conditions, do hit subscribe, follow my ramblings and see if it might help you in your orchid journey. And our orchid journey today is pulling right up at the doorstep of Laelia. What an amazing group of orchids. And can I just say, it is early winter here in Melbourne. And look at these amazing flowers on these long stems, giving us pure tropical magic in less than tropical conditions, let me just tell you, because it is chilly. And I have made a video about Laelia before, but that was a couple of years ago, I think, and much water under the orchid bridge, let me just tell you, since then. So I thought, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an update on Laelia, basic care, and what I have learned so far, which is probably obvious to many, but really quite important. So let's dive right in. Firstly, Laelia, now fantastic name, apparently named after one of the Vestal Virgins, who was attached to the cult of Vesta. Who knows quite why that name was given to them, but really who cares? And this is Laelia anceps, which is a Southern Mexican, Central American species. And anceps means flattened, two-headed or two-sided. And what it refers to is the stem. And if you run your finger up, it definitely feels like it's been squished and there's sort of a ridge up the side. So very interesting. Anyway, that's Laelia, and in this case, anceps. There are apparently sort of two distinct forms of Laelia anceps, one from the west side of the mountain range in southern Mexico and one on the east side. And the west coast ones, I think, are predominantly white, and the east coast ones are other colors. And growing at quite high altitudes, which means that they are a perfect orchid for me because they can take cool, cold winter nighttime minimums and winter conditions. So an incredibly hardy, really tough orchid. So let's find out a little bit more about Laelia. And what we might do, plant lovers, is consult an oracle, Growing Orchids. This is book 2 by J.N. Rentoul. There you go. He was an Australian grower. This is a 4-volume series of books, and you'll be able to find them on vintage book platforms. So just have a Google, Growing Orchids by J.N. Rentoul. I actually was in a secondhand bookshop this morning and saw volume 4. There you go, for like $5 or something. So they're out there. There's 4 volumes, and 1 volume is dedicated to Australian orchids, and the other 3 basically every other genus. What I hadn't realized is that with our Laelia friends, there are 2 distinct types. There are the Mexican and Southern Mexican, Central American types, which are higher altitude cool growers. Then there are the ones further south in South America, heading into Brazil, which are lower altitude and warmer growers, and certainly probably wouldn't thrive in my outdoor conditions. I didn't realize there was such a distinction. So now I know, plant lovers, I need to focus all my attention on Mexican Laelias and their hybrid offspring. So let's just see what J.N. Rentoul has to say about it, because it's quite interesting. Usually it was found on trees on the fringes of forests, but it is also rupicolous or lithophytic. Now, I never heard of this word before, rupicolous, which basically means living on or in rocks, which is the same as lithophytic, so I don't quite know what the distinction is. Anyway, the seasons are something of extremes in the habitat, with considerable rain from May to October. That's in the Northern Hemisphere, which is spring, summer, autumn. The plants getting quite saturated at night and sometimes very cold. Mostly the days are quite dry with bright sunlight. This should be one of the cultural features. The plants in the habitat flower about November, which would be early winter in the Northern Hemisphere, usually in a short dry season followed by rain in February, which would be late winter, early spring, with damp, humid weather until May, when the rainy season starts again. So there we go. Interesting, because those are conditions that I can easily replicate here. So this is a form of Laelia anceps. It's a no ID that I got from, I'm not sure where actually I got this one from. It could well have been from Facebook Marketplace. They are very easy to find as divisions actually, because let's have a look at the plant. Can you see? Looks a lot like Cattleya, obviously. The flowers certainly do, and it's certainly been hybridized with Cattleyas to produce all sorts of wonderful flowers. So you can see you've got fairly shortish squat pseudobulbs, but a real running rhizomous growth habit. And they're quite chunky, vigorous plants with a lot of aerial roots. So they can be quite tricky to manage as a plant because it is going to get quite bulky. You could kind of control it by hanging it in a basket or having it in a pot that you basically just don't repot it in to sort of control its desire to get bigger. And I have another one that's in bloom right now that is just so big and wonderful. I actually can't move it for the minute, which doesn't, again, bode well for actually moving. Anyway, and it's a much darker magenta. So I've got a darker one. I have this one, which is these two beautiful pinks, and I have a white form, which, as we just discovered, is probably from the west coast of Mexico, derived from the ancestor thereof. So some very good clues in that book, which I've accidentally achieved myself. So the first thing is high altitude, and it can take cold. And in fact, it can take sub-zero centigrade, sub 32 Fahrenheit, and little gentle frost. So you could even try growing this outside in a mild climate in the Northern Hemisphere. So Ireland or parts of southern Britain, perhaps, and certainly parts of the United States, where it's not consistently freezing in winter. So areas sort of more similar to me, maybe San Francisco, I think, has a relatively similar climate to Melbourne. An orchid that you could have a go at. Now, I would say perhaps if you can grow peonies in your climate without killing them, you might be able to grow Laelia anceps outside. Who knows? So that's the first thing. High altitude, it likes and needs those cooler temperatures to really stimulate its flowers, which occur towards the end of autumn, early winter. So mine, this one came into bloom in late autumn. The other ones are really just opening now as we're into the first weeks of winter. So a great flower to have at this time of year when it is so cold and miserable, and you have these gorgeous tropical blooms bouncing around. So that's temperature. It can certainly take warmer conditions, but it does need the seasons. So as long as you can give it cooler winters, it can certainly take hotter temperatures. And here in Melbourne, we can get really hot summers, you know, up to 40 degrees and plus centigrade. So, you know, over 110 Fahrenheit. So hot, hot, hot. Not all the time, but it can happen. These orchids can deal with it as long as they get a cool winter. Now, the other thing that we just found out about these Mexican Laelias and their hybrid offspring is that watering, that moisture issue. So wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry. And I think to make that simpler for oneself, basically what I do is I drench these in the warmer parts of the year. So from sort of mid-ish spring all the way through until the weather really turns in autumn at some point. Constant watering and pretty constant liquid feed of some description. So either a tonic, such as a seaweed-based solution, or liquid orchid fertilizer, always diluted down to 1/8, 1/10. But I try and do that at least once a week in summer with these Laelias. So they're putting on a lot of vegetative growth at that point. Then as the weather turns into autumn, I just dial it right down. Then you start to get the flower spikes. And what I do when it comes into bloom is try and really turn down the watering quite a lot until the flowers have happened and then withered, and then I'll start watering it again. So giving it a dry-ish rest as it's coming into bloom, as it's blooming, and then ending that as the flowers end. Now, you don't need to panic about that and mark it in your calendar and rue the day that you should overwater it. These orchids, I think, are as tough as nuts and a great orchid for a beginner grower because it is quite hard to kill it. Although, we'll get to my story in a minute. So I think even if you do give it too much water in winter, it's not going to turn up its toes on you, but it's better to just generally dial down the water in winter for a couple of months and then start to introduce it again as you get into late winter, early spring. And there you go. Relatively simple on that front. It's also a tough plant in terms of getting water on the leaves and in the junctions. You know, a lot of plants do not like being cold and wet. Laelia doesn't seem to be affected by rot so much for me anyway. So it's not something I stress about getting water in it. So I just use a hose to water mine. I'm not fancy at all unless I'm feeding it. Now, let's get to that light issue. So I knew that they were an orchid that wanted bright indirect light. And having seen some images of the plant growing in the wild, you can actually see it does get direct sun. Now, direct sun in its native habitat versus your direct sun, obviously very different, completely different parts of the world. And my direct sun in Melbourne is not the direct sun of high altitude Mexican mountains, let me tell you. So you can't just kind of replicate one condition from the wild into your conditions, which I did. So mine weren't flowering that well, and I thought they need more light. So I just moved all of my three, so this one, the darker one, and the white one, into a spot where it gets direct sunlight for quite a few hours in the morning. But I did that in late spring, early summer. So that's quite fierce sun. So they went from relatively indirect but shaded conditions, but bright indirect light, to direct sun at probably a point of the year where it's strongest and harshest. Duh, really stupid, Matthew, because what happened? Yes, the leaves burnt. And in fact, on the albiform, the white one, all the leaves burnt and dropped off. Luckily, I didn't panic because it is a tough orchid and it did grow back for me. So it immediately sent out new growths to repair itself. It skipped a season flowering because there was more important things for it to do, like survive, but it's recovered. So the moral of the story is, yes, they can take direct light in the morning, but I would then give it afternoon or sort of midday to afternoon protection. But if you're going to do that, do it gently. Gently introduce the plant to that lighting condition so the leaves can toughen up and get used to it. And try and do it in late winter, early spring, before the sun really gets harsh. So I have learned my lesson, and now mine are under a polycarbonate roof as high as I can get them. So they're getting consistently bright indirect light, and look, they are happy as Larry and blooming for me. I did set them all back though, I must say. I would have had more flowers and more growth points this year if I hadn't have done that, because the plants have really been focused on creating new growths and leaves. So the growths that would have flowered for me, I denuded by burning them. So they just switched all their energy to sending out new growths. Anyway, that is one of the things you learn, plant lovers. Anyway, so light is important to get these to bloom, but just be careful. So bright indirect light will be fine. The kind of conditions you grow your Cattleyas in would be fine for these. And look, mine has certainly flowered in those conditions. So if you are in a spot where you can grow them outside and you can do the direct sun, just be careful. Now, potting. I alluded to the fact that they're tricky, look. So they really can ramble and get very rhizomy. So the flowers emerge from the previous season's growth, and I'll come in and show you exactly. So here we have a matured pseudobulb, and they have a single leaf, very, very leathery, hence you can get a sense that they're quite tough. And out of that comes your raceme, and you can get multiple flower heads. Now I've got two on this one, and one on this, and one on this. You can get sort of up to 6, I think, quite a large number of flowers on each raceme. But as I said, mine, I think, was just focusing on recovering after I nearly burnt them to death. But potting medium-wise, as we found out, they're an opportunistic grower, so in nooks and crannies in quite exposed conditions. So it's a lithophilic orchid, so where material has probably gathered in crevices and cracks, so you might get a little bit of, you'll get broken down leaf material, etc., etc. So basically light and free draining, and whatever that means for you. So for me, that means medium bark, and it's a really vigorous root system, as you can see, lots of aerial roots, and the orchid will certainly fill out all those gaps in a medium to large bark mix. Now it is a lithophyte, so if you want, you can put a little bit of pumice in there just to lighten it up a little bit. Doesn't really matter. I think whatever works for you that is free draining and quite aerated is the way to go. The other thing you can see, I have got these fabulous pre-pierced terracotta orchid pots with actually drilled holes for hanging wires. Really great. I got these from a local supplier, and these particular ones he doesn't have anymore, but they came from Vietnam. So wherever you are in the world, maybe just Google Vietnamese terracotta orchid pot and see if you can find a seller of them. In fact, many years ago when I was in Brazil and I went to the Botanic Gardens in Rio, They had an amazing orchid house. But one of the things that just transfixed me was these beautiful terracotta orchid pots that they had, all covered in moss. And that's kind of one of those images that seared into my brain that I kind of want. That's what I want my orchids to look like. The hothouse in the Rio Botanic Gardens. Now, the other thing that you will notice is just how long these flower spikes are, and the flowers really nod and they're beautiful. So I think, as that book alluded to, they grow on the edges of forests, which is often where, like, for example, if there's a rocky outcrop, tends not to be trees, or by the side of water. It's where there's more light generally. Generally, where you find more flowers in tropical conditions, it's along river courses or exposed areas, or in the roof canopy, top of trees where there's more light, hence lots of things are epiphytic. So this plant clearly is growing in those more exposed areas, and it has these beautiful long nodding flowers to attract its pollinator. And when my first Laelia bloomed and the spike just kept getting longer and longer and longer and longer, I thought, oh no, it's really leggy. It's searching for the light. I'm not giving it enough, because with other plants, if you get a really long, straggly flower, it's because it's not getting enough light and it's kind of desperately searching. Not the case with Laelias. They have very long flower spikes. And in fact, this is almost short. They can be twice as long. I think, as I said, I have got mine. A, I nearly killed them through burning them, so they're in recovery mode. And B, they're actually quite close to the polycarbonate roof. And interestingly, the flower spikes have grown to fill that space. So they've stopped short of actually touching the polycarbonate. Interesting. I think if they had more distance, they probably would have grown longer. Anyway, just an interesting oddity to note that you've got long flower spikes. So if you don't have much space, Laelia, well, this sort of Laelia anceps can be a little tricky because they are bulky and it will bulk up quite quickly. And as you can see from my plant, we have got two distinct growing directions and the plant is branching. So this end of the plant is now branching into two. This one is in one, but quite quickly it'll take control of this whole pot, which I'm fine about because they look beautiful as specimen plants and you'll get all these amazing flowers. Now, some are supposed to be fragrant, but I have never smelt a fragrance from any of mine. So love to know if your Laelia anceps are fragrant or not, but really, who cares? Look at those flowers. They are enormous, they're long lasting, and it blooms in early winter when the sight of this tropical flower brings joy to the heart. So as you can see, this one, pale pink with a deeper mauve lip. As I said, I've got quite a magenta red one, which is quite strong, and then a pure white one, which is very elegant. If I've got pictures, I'll drop them in. But the white one, unfortunately, suffered the most in its summer skin damage. So that lost all its leaves and it's just taken 2 years to recover, poor darling. So mine are outside all year, but it would be a very easy plant to grow indoors. Firstly, if you have the space, because they are quite large. And secondly, if you can give it bright, indirect light and that coolness in winter. So often against windows is great. So if you're in somewhere where it's quite heated in winter indoors, the coldness of the glass in winter can be enough to give the plant that sense of coolness. And I know that Rachel at Gardening Influencer, a wonderful channel where I first learned many of my orchid growing ideas, Rachel grows her Cattleyas on kitchen windowsill. In fact, she published a book about growing them in those conditions. So very similar conditions that a Laelia would want as a Cattleya. So if you've got that bright spot that can get a little bit of a chill in winter, you can certainly grow these inside as long as you've got the room. So there we are, plant lovers. A little bit of a Laelia, a Mexican cooler growing Laelia update. I do have some others and I'm now worried, now that I understand there's that complete difference between the cooler growing ones and the warmer growing ones, I need to just check some of the others that I've got, because I've just assumed they were all the same, which is really stupid. Anyway, plant lovers, I'm thrilled to have these in bloom. A really easy orchid for the beginner. As long as you can find the right spot and you've got the space for it, it will bloom for you. They only flower once a year, but when they do, the flowers last a long time and they're really dramatic. So there we go. Many thanks for watching. Who knows what we'll be doing next week, but there'll be something exciting, I'm sure. So hit subscribe if you want to find out. I post every week on a Friday. Amateur ramblings, as you've discovered, but every now and then things do work and I do make terrible mistakes, but maybe me making them will prevent you from making them, and you can save your orchids. Anyway, plant lovers, I hope all's well in your world, your orchids are behaving well, and I look forward to seeing you next week.